There are debts that money cannot pay and promises that death cannot break. Claire Davidson knew both as she stood in the doorway of the one-room schoolhouse, watching the last of her students disappear down the dusty road toward Pine Ridge. The Colorado autumn of 1899 painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, but Claire saw only the foreclosure notice crumpled in her trembling hand. 60 days. That's all the time Banker Whitmore had given her to settle Frank's debts. Debts she never knew existed until 3 months after they buried him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. High above on Eagle Peak, a figure moved through the pine shadows like smoke given form. Jacob Hayes paused in his descent, the widow's silhouette framed in the schoolhouse doorway, pulling at something deep in his chest. For 2 years, he had watched the town below from his mountain perch, and for 2 years, he had noticed her. The way she walked with purpose despite her obvious struggles. The way she tended her small garden with the same careful attention she gave her students. The way she still wore her wedding ring like armor against a world that seemed determined to take everything she held dear. Jacob shifted the weight of the deer across his shoulders and continued down the hidden trail. He had learned to avoid human contact since the Silver Creek disaster, since 12 good men died, because he miscalculated the load-bearing capacity of the support beams. The mountain had become his confessor, his judge, and his jailer. But lately, dreams had been visiting him, dreams of a woman with sad eyes and gentle hands, dreams that felt more like prophecy than imagination. Claire locked the schoolhouse door with the heavy iron key and began her evening walk home. The Davidson homestead sat on 40 acres of the prettiest land in the valley, where Silver Creek meandered through meadows that Frank had planned to turn into pasture for the cattle they never bought. The mortgage papers in her satchel felt heavier than all the books she carried. Each payment schedule a reminder of promises she couldn't keep to a man who couldn't hear her apologies. She paused at the creek's edge, watching the water catch. The last light of day. Frank used to say this spot was where he fell in love with the land before he fell in love with her. Now it might as well be marked with a tombstone, because in 60 days, Richard Blackwood would own it all. The developer had made his intentions clear through his lawyer, through the banker, and through the thinly veiled threats delivered by his hired men. Pine Ridge was sitting on a fortune in natural beauty, and wealthy Eastern tourists would pay handsomely for the privilege of playing at mountain life in a luxury resort. The Silver Creek mine had been dead for 3 years, but Jacob Hayes still heard the screams in his sleep. Every night at precisely 11:47, the moment when support beam number 6 had snapped like a matchstick, he would jolt awake. In his cabin with the taste of cold dust in his mouth and the weight of 12 souls pressing against his chest. The official inquiry had cleared him of wrongdoing. Geological instability, they called it. An act of God. But God hadn't calculated those load specifications. God hadn't assured the foreman that the new tunnel was safe. God hadn't sent 12 fathers and sons into the earth to die. The cabin on Eagle Peak had been Jacob's sanctuary for 5 years now, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled and stones he'd hauled up the treacherous trail that wound around Devil's Canyon. It was a good cabin, solid and true, with a stone fireplace that drew perfectly and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. His workshop occupied the back room, filled with tools that had once served the railroad and now shaped wood and metal into useful things. Beautiful things. Things nobody would ever see because Jacob Hayes no longer believed he deserved to share his creations with the world. But he was not a hermit by nature, despite what the people of Pine Ridge whispered when they thought no one was listening. Samuel Wright at the general store would tell anyone who'd listen about the ghost of Eagle Peak, the wild man who came down from the mountain 4 times a year to trade pelts and carved items for supplies. The stories grew with each telling. Some claimed he was 7 feet tall with hair to his waist. Others swore he could call down lightning and speak to bears. Jacob, who stood an unremarkable 5 feet 10 inches and kept his brown hair and beard neatly trimmed, found the legends more amusing than offensive. The truth was simpler and more painful. Jacob Hayes watched over Pine Ridge because he had learned to care from a distance, to protect without being seen, to serve without being thanked. It was a kind of penance, he supposed, this constant vigilance over people who would cross the street to avoid him if they knew who he really was. But it was also something else, something he couldn't quite name. A need that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with the way his heart still insisted on beating despite his best efforts to convince it otherwise. From his vantage point near the summit, Jacob could see the entire valley spread below like a living map. He knew that Mrs. Kowalski's cow had gone lame because he'd watched Dr. Carter make a house call with his veterinary bag. He knew that the Miller family's roof was leaking because he'd seen young Tom Miller climbing up there with a hammer and a prayer. He knew that Reverend Jenkins was struggling with his sermon because the man paced his garden every evening, gesturing at his tomatoes, as if they might provide divine inspiration. And he knew that Claire Davidson was in trouble because he'd seen Richard Blackwood's men surveying her property with the predatory intensity of vultures circling wounded prey. Jacob had first noticed the survey crew 3 weeks ago, watching through his father's old spyglass as they tramped across Claire's pasture with their instruments and their clipboards. Blackwood himself had arrived 2 days later in a fancy buggy pulled by matched black horses, the kind of transportation that announced a man's importance to anyone within a mile. He'd spent an hour walking the property lines with his surveyor, pointing at features in the landscape with the proprietary air of someone who had already decided the outcome of the negotiation. The thought of Claire losing her home settled in Jacob's stomach like a cold stone. He had been watching her for 2 years now, not in any improper way, but with the careful attention of a man who had forgotten how to look away from beauty when he encountered it. There was something about her that caught the light differently. The way she moved through her daily routines with such deliberate grace despite the weight of her circumstances. She taught school with a patience that never seemed forced, tended her garden with the care of someone who understood that growing things required both strength and gentleness, and walked to church every Sunday with her head held high even though Jacob could see the tiredness in her shoulders from half a mile away. He had carved things for her, though she would never know it. A music box with an intricate rose pattern on the lid sat on his workshop shelf, its melody soft and sweet when wound. A jewelry box with a hidden compartment where a woman might keep her most precious letters. A butter churn handle that would fit her hands perfectly, carved with a pattern of mountain laurel, because he'd noticed the way she stopped to admire the wild bushes that bloomed near the schoolhouse each spring. These were gifts he would never give, tokens of an affection he had no right to feel for a woman who deserved better than the broken shell of a man he had become. But watching her struggle against forces beyond her control awakened something in Jacob that he'd thought dead since the mine collapse. For 5 years, he had accepted his isolation as both punishment and protection. The world was safer without his miscalculations, his overconfidence, his fatal tendency to trust in his own expertise when lives hung in the balance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He had convinced himself that solitude was noble, that removing himself from society was the responsible thing to do. Now, as he watched Claire Davidson fight a battle she couldn't win alone, Jacob began to wonder if his exile had been less about protecting others and more about protecting himself. Fear was a luxury he could afford when only his own welfare was at stake. But watching someone he cared about face ruin while he remained safely hidden on his mountain felt less like nobility and more like cowardice. The deer he'd killed that morning hung cleaned and quartered in his smokehouse, enough meat to last through the winter if he rationed carefully. His root cellar was stocked with vegetables from his garden, preserved according to methods his mother had taught him before consumption claimed her 20 years ago. His workshop was filled with finished projects that would fetch good prices if he ever found the courage to bring them to market. He was as self-sufficient as a man could be in the Colorado wilderness, wanting for nothing except the one thing he had denied himself for 5 long years: human connection, the simple pleasure of a conversation that mattered, the basic satisfaction of helping someone who needed help not because duty demanded it, but because kindness called for it. The possibility that he might be more than the sum of his failures, that redemption might be something a man could earn rather than something he had to suffer without. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Jacob Hayes stood at the window of his cabin and made a decision that would change 2 lives forever. Tomorrow, he would go down the mountain, not to the general store for supplies, not to trade pelts for necessities, but to find a way to help Claire Davidson save her home. He didn't know how, didn't know if she would accept assistance from a stranger, didn't even know if she would speak to him without fear. But he knew he couldn't watch her lose everything while he remained safe in his fortress of guilt and solitude. The mine disaster had taught him that good intentions weren't enough, that expertise meant nothing without wisdom, that confidence could kill as surely as a loaded gun. But it had also taught him that some mistakes couldn't be undone, only atoned for through the choices that came after. Claire Davidson needed help, and Jacob Hayes needed to be more than the ghost of Eagle Peak. Maybe those two needs could solve each other, or maybe he would only add to her troubles with his broken attempts at heroism. But for the first time, in 5 years, Jacob was willing to risk finding out. He spent the evening cleaning his good clothes, the ones he'd worn to testify at the mine inquiry, and then packed away like grave clothes. He trimmed his beard with the careful precision of a man preparing for battle, checking his reflection in the small mirror above his washstand. The face that looked back at him was older than his 42 years, weathered by mountain sun and marked by the particular kind of tiredness that came from carrying guilt like a stone in his chest. But there was something else in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there that morning. Purpose, maybe, or hope, if he dared to call it that. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own possibilities for failure. But tonight, Jacob Hayes went to sleep without dreams of the mine for the first time in 5 years. Instead, he dreamed of a woman with gentle hands and sad eyes who might, if he was very lucky and very careful, allow him to help carry her burdens for a while. The mountain wind whispered through the pines outside his window, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of winter. But inside the cabin, a fire burned steady and warm, ready to kindle whatever hope the morning might bring. The roosters, crow from the Patterson farm, echoed across the valley as Jacob secured the leather straps on his pack, checking each item with the methodical precision that had once made him the most trusted engineer on the Denver and Rio Grande line. Extra clothes, his father's compass, a small leather pouch containing his savings from years of careful trading, and wrapped in oiled cloth, the music box he had carved during the long winter nights when sleep eluded him. Today felt different, charged with possibility in a way that made his hands steadier than they had been in years. The trail down Eagle Peak was treacherous in the best of conditions, a winding path that Jacob had carved himself around granite outcroppings and across narrow ledges that would send most men scrambling back to safety. But Jacob knew every loose rock, every root that might catch a boot, every place where the morning frost would make the footing uncertain. He had walked this path in darkness and in storm, in the desperate early days when isolation felt like drowning, and the only cure was movement, any movement that might exhaust his body enough to quiet his mind. As he descended, the sounds of civilization grew clearer. The distant lowing of cattle, the rhythmic thwack of someone splitting wood, the church bell that marked the hours in Pine Ridge like a heartbeat keeping time for the entire valley. These were sounds he had trained himself to ignore, reminders of a world he no longer felt he belonged to. But this morning they seemed like invitations, calls to rejoin the human community he had abandoned in his grief and guilt. The morning sun climbed higher as Jacob made his way down the mountainside, and with it came the realization that he had no clear plan beyond the vague intention to help Claire Davidson. What did he know about foreclosures and bank loans, and the kind of legal maneuvering that men like Richard Blackwood used to separate honest people from their property? His expertise lay in calculating loads and stresses, in understanding how much weight a beam could bear before it snapped. But perhaps, he reflected as he navigated a particularly steep section of trail, those skills might prove more relevant than he initially thought. Claire Davidson had been awake since before dawn, standing at her kitchen window with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The foreclosure notice lay spread on her table beside the household ledgerware. She had calculated and recalculated the figures until the numbers blurred together into an impossible equation. 60 days to find $800, a sum that might as well have been $8,000 for all the hope she had of raising it. Her teacher's salary barely covered the basic expenses of keeping the homestead running and the small income from selling eggs and vegetables at the Saturday market wouldn't make a dent in the debt that Frank had somehow accumulated without her knowledge. The worst part was the mystery of it. Frank had been careful with money, almost to a fault. He planned every purchase, saved for months before buying even necessities, and talked through every financial decision with the thoroughness of a man who understood that one bad choice could ruin a family's future. The idea that he had borrowed money from Banker Whitmore without telling her made no sense, unless something had happened in those final months before the hunting accident that Frank had kept hidden from her. Claire had spent the night going through Frank's papers again, searching for some clue that might explain the debt or provide a solution. His personal effects were few and carefully organized, kept in the wooden box that had belonged to his father and his father before him. Letters from his brother in Kansas, the deed to the property, their marriage certificate, and a small bundle of receipts for various purchases over the years. Nothing that suggested financial trouble, nothing that hinted at the desperate circumstances that had apparently driven him to Whitmore's office with his hat in his hand. The sound of horses in her yard interrupted Claire's brooding. Through the window, she saw two men dismounting near her front gate, both wearing the kind of clothes that marked them as outsiders, city men with business in the country. She recognized one of them immediately, Deputy James Tucker, a man whose badge had been purchased rather than earned and whose loyalty belonged entirely to whoever paid his salary. The other was a stranger, well-dressed and confident in the way of men who were accustomed to getting what they wanted. Claire smoothed her skirts and checked her appearance in the small mirror by the door before stepping onto the porch. She had learned early in her marriage that men like these respected strength, or at least the appearance of it, and any sign of weakness would be exploited without mercy. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of snow, but the presence of these men seemed to contaminate the peace of her homestead with an aura of threat and calculation. Mrs. Davidson. Deputy Tucker touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that managed to be both polite and mocking. This here is Mr. Caldwell, represents the legal interests of the Blackwood Development Company. He's got some papers for you to look at. Caldwell stepped forward with a folder tucked under his arm and a smile that never reached his eyes. He was a small, neat man with the soft hands of someone who had never done physical labor, and there was something in his manner that reminded Claire unpleasantly of a snake preparing to strike. Mrs. Davidson, I hope you've had time to consider Mr. Blackwood's generous offer regarding your property. We're prepared to make the transaction as painless as possible for everyone involved. I've told you before, Mr. Caldwell, and I'll tell you again. This property is not for sale. Claire kept her voice level and calm, though her heart was racing. My husband and I built our life here, and I intend to honor his memory by keeping our home. Caldwell's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfect. Mrs. Davidson, I'm afraid you may not understand the full scope of your situation. Your late husband's debts to First National Bank create certain legal obligations that transcend personal sentiment. Mr. Blackwood is offering to purchase your property for enough money to settle those debts and provide you with a comfortable sum to start fresh elsewhere. It's really quite generous, considering the circumstances. The folder in Caldwell's hands seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and Claire had no doubt that whatever papers it contained would be carefully crafted to leave her with no legal recourse. She had seen enough of Richard Blackwood's business practices to know that his offers were rarely as generous as they appeared on the surface, and his definitions of comfortable and elsewhere probably differed significantly from her own. I'm not interested in Mr. Blackwood's offer, generous or otherwise, Claire said firmly. This is my home, and I won't be driven from it by threats disguised as kindness. Deputy Tucker shifted his weight and rested his hand on the grip of his pistol, a gesture that was meant to appear casual but carried an unmistakable message. Now, Mrs. Davidson, nobody's talking about threats here. We're just trying to help. You understand the legal realities of your situation. Mr. Caldwell here is a lawyer, educated back east, and he knows about these things. Maybe you should listen to what he has to say. Claire felt the familiar surge of anger that came whenever men assumed she was too simple or too emotional to understand business matters. Frank had always treated her as an equal partner in their decisions, seeking her counsel on everything from crop rotation to household budgets. The idea that she needed these strangers to explain her own circumstances was both insulting and infuriating. I understand my situation perfectly, Deputy Tucker, she said, ice creeping into her voice. What I don't understand is why Mr. Blackwood is so interested in this particular piece of property that he's willing to send lawyers and law enforcement to pressure a widow into selling. Perhaps you could enlighten me about that." Caldwell and Tucker exchanged a look that confirmed Claire's suspicions about the true nature of their visit. This wasn't about helping her understand anything. This was about applying pressure, about making her feel isolated and vulnerable until she agreed to whatever terms they offered. The realization strengthened her resolve, even as it reminded her how alone she truly was in this fight. "Mrs. Davidson." Caldwell opened his folder and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers. "Perhaps these documents will help clarify matters for you. This is a copy of the promissory note your husband signed, along with the payment schedule he agreed to. As you can see, the terms were quite clear, and the consequences of default were explicitly outlined." Claire took the papers with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from anger or fear, she couldn't say. The legal language was dense and complicated, full of whereas and heretofore and other phrases designed to obscure rather than illuminate. But the numbers were clear enough. $800 principal, plus interest compounding monthly, plus penalties for late payment that had already begun to accumulate. The total amount due was growing like a cancer, feeding on itself until it became impossible to satisfy. But there was something else in the documents that made Claire's blood run cold. The date on the promissory note was 3 weeks after Frank's funeral. Someone had forged his signature, using his death as cover for a fraud so brazen and cruel that it took her breath away. The handwriting was similar enough to fool a casual observer, but Claire knew Frank's signature as well as she knew her own face. He had written his name on their marriage certificate, on the deed to their property, on countless letters and documents throughout their marriage. This signature was close, but it wasn't his. "This document is a forgery," Claire said quietly, the words dropping into the morning air like stones into still water. "My husband never signed this note. He was already dead when this was supposedly executed." The silence that followed her accusation stretched long and tense, broken only by the distant sound of the church bell marking 9 o'clock. Caldwell's face had gone pale beneath his carefully groomed mustache, and Deputy Tucker's hand had moved closer to his weapon. These were not the reactions of men who had been caught in an innocent mistake. "Mrs. Davidson," Caldwell's voice had lost its oily smoothness and taken on a harder edge. "I think you're understandably confused by your grief and your difficult circumstances. Legal documents can be complicated, and emotional stress can play tricks on memory. Perhaps you should take some time to reconsider before making accusations you might regret." The threat was unmistakable now, stripped of its polite veneer and delivered with the cold precision of men who were accustomed to intimidating their opposition into submission. But Claire had been teaching school for 15 years, had faced down bullies both large and small, and she recognized the particular brand of cowardice that hid behind official authority and legal paperwork. "I'm not confused about anything," she said, her voice gaining strength from her growing anger. "This signature is not my husband's. This debt is not legitimate, and your presence on my property is not welcome. I suggest you leave before I decide to file charges for fraud and harassment." Deputy Tucker stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Now you listen here, lady. You're in no position to be making threats or demands. Mr. Blackwood has important friends in this territory, friends who don't take kindly to people who interfere with legitimate business interests. It would be a shame if something unfortunate happened to a woman living all alone out here with no man to protect her." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Claire felt the familiar chill of fear that came with the realization that she was truly alone in this fight. There was no one to call for help, no authority to appeal to when the local law enforcement was part of the conspiracy against her. For a moment, the weight of her isolation threatened to crush her spirit and force her to accept whatever terms these men offered. But then she remembered Frank's voice on their wedding day, promising to love and protect her for as long as they both should live. He was gone, but the love remained, and with it the strength to stand against those who would use his death as an opportunity to rob her of everything they had built together. She might be alone, but she was not defenseless, and she would not surrender her home without a fight. "Get off my property," Claire said, her voice steady and cold as winter morning. "Both of you. And tell Mr. Blackwood that if he wants my land, he'll have to take it through honest legal means, not through forgery and intimidation." Caldwell gathered his papers with hands that shook slightly. Whether from anger or nervousness, Claire couldn't tell. "You're making a serious mistake, Mrs. Davidson. Mr. Blackwood's patience has limits, and his methods of persuasion can become quite creative when circumstances require it. I strongly suggest you reconsider your position before those circumstances arise." As the two men mounted their horses and rode away, Claire remained on her porch, watching until they disappeared around the bend in the road. Only then did she allow herself to sink into the wooden chair that Frank had made for their first anniversary, her legs suddenly too weak to support her weight. The morning that had begun with such promise now felt heavy with dread, and the 60 days until foreclosure seemed to stretch ahead of her like a prison sentence. But she had learned something important during the confrontation, something that might prove useful if she could figure out how to use it. Richard Blackwood was so determined to acquire her property that he was willing to commit fraud to get it. That suggested her land was worth far more than anyone had told her, and it meant that Blackwood had vulnerabilities that could be exploited if she was clever enough to find them. The question was whether she could find those vulnerabilities before Blackwood found more creative ways to pressure her into submission. She was one woman alone against men with money, connections, and a willingness to break the law to get what they wanted. The odds were heavily against her, but Frank had always said that the most important battles were won not by the strongest fighters, but by those who refused to quit when quitting seemed like the only sensible option. Claire Davidson had never been accused of being sensible when it came to fighting for what she believed in. And right now, she believed in keeping her home, no matter what it cost her. Jacob reached the outskirts of Pine Ridge just as the church bells finished marking the 10 o'clock hour, his descent from Eagle Peak having taken longer than usual due to his unfamiliarity with traveling the trail while burdened with his pack and his racing thoughts. The town spread before him like a collection of children's toys arranged in a mountain meadow, small and neat, and somehow more vulnerable than it appeared from his lofty perch. Main Street bisected the settlement from east to west, lined with false-fronted buildings that proclaimed the optimism of earlier days when the silver mines were producing and the future seemed bright with possibility. Samuel Wright was sweeping the front porch of his general store when Jacob emerged from the tree line, and the shopkeeper's broom froze mid-stroke as he caught sight of the mountain man walking down the main road in broad daylight. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the dusty street, one mouth agape with surprise, and the other set in a line of determination that brooked no retreat. Then Wright dropped his broom and ducked inside the store, presumably to spread the news that the ghost of Eagle Peak had materialized in the flesh and was walking among ordinary mortals. Jacob suppressed a smile at the shopkeeper's reaction and continued down the street, noting the way conversations stopped and heads turned as he passed. He had forgotten how it felt to be the object of attention, both curious and wary, and he was surprised to discover that the sensation wasn't entirely unpleasant. For 5 years, he had been invisible by choice, a rumor and a legend, but not a man with substance and purpose. Today, he was undeniably real, and that reality carried with it both opportunity and responsibility. The First National Bank of Pine Ridge occupied a corner lot at the intersection of Main Street and Church Avenue, its brick facade and barred windows designed to project an image of solidity and trustworthiness that Jacob found ironically appropriate given what he suspected about the institution's recent activities. George Whitmore had taken over as president 3 years ago, after the previous banker died in a riding accident that some folks whispered hadn't been entirely accidental. Since then, the bank's lending practices had become both more aggressive and more selective, with certain customers receiving remarkably favorable terms while others found themselves facing impossible demands. Jacob positioned himself across the street from the bank, settling onto a bench outside the barber shop where he could observe the comings and goings without attracting undue attention. His plan, such as it was, involved gathering information before taking action, learning enough about Blackwood's operation to identify weaknesses that might be exploited. It was an engineer's approach to problem-solving, methodical and thorough, though he admitted to himself that human institutions were far more complex and unpredictable than the mathematical certainties he was accustomed to dealing with. The morning traffic in and out of the bank was light, consisting mostly of merchants making deposits and housewives conducting routine business. But just before 11 o'clock, a familiar figure emerged from the building and paused to light a cigar. On the front steps, Richard Blackwood was shorter than Jacob had expected, a compact man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of expensive clothing that announced his importance to anyone within viewing distance. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way, surveying the street like a general reviewing his troops before battle. Blackwood was joined moments later by Banker Whitmore, a thin, nervous man whose eyes darted constantly, as if he expected trouble to materialize from any direction. The two men spoke in low voices for several minutes, their body language suggesting a conversation of some urgency and importance. Jacob wished he could hear their words, but even from across the street, their manner told him that whatever they were discussing involved more than routine banking business. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Deputy Tucker, who dismounted from his horse with the clumsy haste of a man bearing important news. The three men formed a tight circle on the bank's front steps, their voices dropping even lower. As Tucker delivered what appeared to be a report of some kind, Jacob watched Blackwood's face darken with anger, saw Whitmore wring his hands like a man contemplating his own funeral, and observed Tucker's defensive posture suggesting that his news had not been well received. After several minutes of intense discussion, the meeting broke up with visible signs of frustration from all parties. Blackwood stalked back into the bank with the rigid gait of a man fighting to control his temper, while Whitmore scurried after him like a faithful dog following an angry master. Tucker remained on the steps for a moment longer, checking his pocket watch and scanning the street with the alertness of a man expecting trouble, before mounting his horse and riding off toward the south end of town. Jacob remained on his bench, processing what he had observed and trying to piece together the implications. Tucker's report had clearly upset Blackwood's plans, and the deputy's subsequent departure suggested that some kind of response was being prepared. Given the timing and the participants involved, Jacob felt confident that the meeting had concerned Claire Davidson and her refusal to cooperate with whatever pressure had been applied to her that morning. The thought of Claire facing intimidation and threats while he sat safely on his mountain filled Jacob with a mixture of guilt and rage that surprised him with its intensity. For 5 years, he had told himself that isolation was noble, that removing himself from human affairs was the responsible thing to do. But watching the machinery of corruption and greed grinding forward while an innocent woman stood in its path made him question every assumption he had made about duty and responsibility. As Jacob sat contemplating his next move, a commotion at the far end of Main Street caught his attention. A small crowd had gathered around someone or something, their voices carrying across the distance in a buzz of excitement and concern. Jacob rose from his bench and walked toward the disturbance, his long legs carrying him quickly down the dusty street past storefronts and sidewalk loungers who stared at him with open curiosity. The crowd had formed around Dr. Henry Carter, who was kneeling beside an elderly woman who appeared to have collapsed while walking to the market. Jacob recognized her as Margaret Stone, Claire's neighbor, and one of the few people in town who had shown the widow any real kindness during her time of troubles. Mrs. Stone was conscious but clearly in distress, her breathing shallow and her color poor, while Dr. Carter checked her pulse and asked questions about her symptoms. "Someone needs to fetch Mrs. Davidson," Dr. Carter announced to the gathered crowd. "Mrs. Stone was on her way to see her when this happened, and she's been asking for Claire specifically. I think she has something important to tell her." The crowd exchanged uncertain glances, no one seeming eager to make the journey to the Davidson homestead when there might be trouble brewing between Claire and Blackwood's people. Jacob found himself stepping forward before his conscious mind had fully processed the decision, his voice carrying clearly across the circle of onlookers. "I'll go," he said simply, ignoring the startled looks and whispered comments his offer provoked. "I know the way." Dr. Carter looked up at Jacob with surprise and relief, taking in his weathered clothing and mountain-trained physique with the quick assessment of a medical man evaluating a potential patient. "You're the fellow from Eagle Peak, aren't you? I've heard stories, but I didn't think you were real." "Real enough," Jacob replied, already turning toward the edge of town. "How urgent is this?" "Very," Dr. Carter said grimly. "Mrs. Stone's heart isn't strong, and whatever she's trying to tell Mrs. Davidson seems to be weighing on her heavily. The stress could kill her if she doesn't get some relief soon. Jacob nodded and broke into the ground-eating lope that had carried him across mountain terrain for years, his boots raising small clouds of dust as he left the town behind and headed toward the Davidson homestead. The 2-mile journey passed quickly beneath his steady pace, the familiar rhythm of exertion, helping to clear his mind and focus his thoughts on the task ahead. The Davidson property appeared around a bend in the road like something from a painting, 40 acres of green meadow bisected by the silver thread of the creek and bordered by aspen groves that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. The house itself was modest but well-maintained, a white frame structure with a covered porch and flower boxes beneath the windows that spoke of a woman's touch and a man's pride in providing for his family. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line, and clothes hung on a line behind the house, moving gently in the mountain breeze. Jacob paused at the front gate, suddenly uncertain about his reception and acutely aware that he was about to meet the woman who had occupied so many of his thoughts over the past 2 years. From a distance, Claire Davidson had seemed like a figure from a dream, beautiful and untouchable and safely beyond the reach of his complicated feelings. Now, separated from her only by a wooden gate and his own nervousness, she was about to become real in a way that would change everything. He raised his hand to knock on the front door just as it opened to reveal Claire herself, apparently alerted by the sound of his approaching footsteps. For a moment, they stared at each other in silence, blue eyes meeting brown in a moment of recognition that transcended their actual status as strangers. Jacob felt his carefully prepared words evaporate like morning mist, replaced by a tongue-tied awkwardness that reminded him he had not spoken to a woman other than Mrs. Wright at the general store in over 2 years. Claire, for her part, found herself looking up at a man who seemed to have stepped from the pages of one of the adventure novels she had read as a girl. He was tall and lean and obviously strong, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of outdoor work and mountain living. His brown hair and beard were neatly trimmed despite the stories about his wild appearance, and his eyes held a depth of kindness that seemed at odds with his reputation as a dangerous hermit. Mrs. Davidson, Jacob managed to find his voice, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "I'm Jacob Hayes. I've come from town with word about Mrs. Stone. She's taken ill, and Dr. Carter says she's been asking for you specifically." Claire's hand flew to her throat in alarm, her morning's troubles temporarily forgotten in the face of concern for her friend and neighbor. "Margaret? How serious is it? Should I come immediately?" "Dr. Carter seemed to think it was urgent," Jacob replied, noting the way Claire's genuine concern transformed her features from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "Something about her heart, and something she needs to tell you that seems to be causing her distress." Without hesitation, Claire disappeared into the house and emerged moments later with her shawl and a small basket that presumably contained items useful for tending the sick. "I'll need to hitch up the buggy," she said, more to herself than to Jacob. "Frank's horse is getting old, but he should be able to make the trip if I don't push him too hard." "I can help with that," Jacob offered, then hesitated. "Or if you prefer, I could drive you into town. I'm heading back that way anyway." Claire paused in her hurried preparations, studying Jacob's face with the careful attention of a woman who had learned to be cautious about trusting strangers. There was something about him that seemed familiar, though she was certain they had never met before. Perhaps it was the kindness in his eyes, or the way he stood with his hat in his hands like a man who understood the importance of showing proper respect to a lady. Whatever it was, her instincts told her that Jacob Hayes was not a man she needed to fear. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Hayes," she said finally. "But I don't see a wagon or buggy. Did you walk all the way from town?" Jacob nodded, realizing that his offer might not be as helpful as he had intended. "I did. I'm accustomed to traveling on foot in the mountains. But if time is important, perhaps I could help you with your horse and buggy instead." Claire made a quick decision based on the urgency in Jacob's voice and her own growing anxiety about Margaret's condition. "Actually, if you don't mind the walk back, I'd prefer the company. The roads aren't entirely safe for a woman traveling alone these days, and I'd feel better having someone with me." The admission of vulnerability clearly cost her something, and Jacob felt a surge of protective anger at the circumstances that had made it necessary. A woman should be able to travel freely in her own community without fear, and the fact that Claire felt otherwise spoke volumes about the pressure she was facing from Blackwood and his associates. "It would be my pleasure to escort you, Mrs. Davidson," Jacob said formally, "and I want you to know that you'll be completely safe in my company." Something in his tone convinced Claire that his promise was more than mere politeness, and she found herself relaxing slightly for the first time since Caldwell and Tucker had appeared in her yard that morning. There was a strength about Jacob Hayes that went beyond his obvious physical capabilities, a quality of steady reliability that reminded her of Frank in his better moments. As they set off down the road toward town, walking side by side in companionable silence, Claire found herself stealing glances at her unexpected escort. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own body, his long stride perfectly matched to her shorter one without any apparent effort on his part. His clothes were clean and well-maintained despite their obvious age, and there was nothing about his appearance that suggested the wild mountain man of local legend. "Mr. Hayes," she said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving her property. "I hope you don't mind my asking, but are you really the man they call the Ghost of Eagle Peak?" Jacob's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I suppose I am, though I've never thought of myself in quite those terms. The stories folks tell about me tend to be somewhat exaggerated." "I should hope so," Claire replied with a small laugh that was the first genuine expression of humor Jacob had heard from her. "According to Samuel Wright, you're 8 feet tall and can summon bears to do your bidding." "Only 7.5 feet, Jacob said solemnly, "and the bears are terrible conversationalists. I've been thinking of switching to mountain lions." The unexpected joke startled a genuine laugh from Claire, and the sound went through Jacob like a bolt of lightning, awakening feelings he had thought buried beyond resurrection. It occurred to him that he could spend the rest of his life trying to coax that sound from her throat, that making Claire Davidson laugh might be the most important work he could ever undertake. "In all seriousness," Claire said, her expression growing thoughtful, "why do you live alone on the mountain? If you don't mind my asking, that is. I know it's none of my business." Jacob was quiet for so long that Claire began to think he wasn't going to answer, and she was preparing to apologize for her presumption when he finally spoke. "I had a job once that required me to make decisions about other people's safety. I made a mistake, and people died because of it. I decided that the world was safer without my judgment calls." The simple explanation carried such weight of pain and guilt that Claire felt her heart constrict with sympathy. She recognized the particular quality of grief that came from blaming oneself for circumstances beyond one's control. Having experienced it herself during the long nights when she wondered if she could have somehow prevented Frank's accident. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been a terrible burden to carry alone." "It was," Jacob admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "But lately, I've begun to wonder if carrying it alone was the right choice. Sometimes isolation feels less like penance and more like cowardice." They had reached the outskirts of Pine Ridge, and both of them could see the crowd still gathered around Dr. Carter and Mrs. Stone near the center of town. But neither seemed eager to end their conversation, despite the urgency that had brought them together. There was something happening between them, a connection that felt both inevitable and impossible, like lightning seeking the safest path to Earth. "Mr. Hayes," Claire said as they approached the crowd, "whatever mistakes you may have made in the past, your willingness to help a stranger today suggests that your judgment might be better than you think." Jacob looked down at her with an expression of wonder and gratitude that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. In that moment, she understood why the people of Pine Ridge told stories about the mountain man. There was something otherworldly about Jacob Hayes, a quality of depth and mystery that made ordinary men seem shallow by comparison. "Thank you," he said simply, and Claire heard in those 2 words a wealth of emotion that spoke to the loneliness of his exile and the gratitude of a man unaccustomed to kindness. As they reached the crowd surrounding Mrs. Stone, both Jacob and Claire knew that something fundamental had shifted between them during their brief journey together. Neither could have said exactly what it was, but both felt the weight of possibility settling around them like a cloak, warm and strange and full of promise. Part 4. Revelations and Recognitions. Dr. Carter looked up with relief as Claire and Jacob approached the small crowd gathered around Mrs. Stone, who was now sitting on a chair that someone had brought from the nearby barber shop. The elderly woman's color had improved slightly, but her breathing remained labored, and her eyes held the particular urgency of someone wrestling with important information that demanded immediate attention. Margaret, Claire knelt beside her, friend and neighbor, taking the older woman's weathered hand in both of her own. "How are you feeling? Dr. Carter says you wanted to see me about something important." Mrs. Stone's grip tightened on Claire's hand with surprising strength, her roomy blue eyes focusing with an intensity that cut through the haze of her physical distress. "Claire, dear, I had to tell you. About Frank. About what really happened that day he died." The words came out in a rush, as if she feared that waiting might rob her of the courage to speak them. The crowd around them stirred with interest, but Dr. Carter quickly dispersed the onlookers with the authority of his profession and concern for his patient's privacy. "Give Mrs. Stone some room to breathe," he commanded. "This is a private matter." Within moments, only Claire, Jacob, Dr. Carter, and Mrs. Stone remained in the small circle. The mountain man's unexpected presence accepted without question due to his role in summoning Claire to her friend's side. Claire felt her heart skip as the implications of Mrs. Stone's words began to sink in. Frank's death had been ruled an accidental shooting during a solo hunting trip, his body found 3 days later by a search party when he failed to return home. The investigation had been brief and perfunctory, conducted by Deputy Tucker with the kind of casual indifference that suggested the outcome was predetermined. But now Mrs. Stone was suggesting that there was more to the story than anyone had been told. "What do you mean, Margaret?" Claire asked gently, though every instinct told her that she might not want to hear the answer. "Frank died in a hunting accident. That's what Deputy Tucker said, what everyone said." Mrs. Stone shook her head with the vehemence of someone correcting. "A dangerous falsehood. No, dear. No accident. I saw them that morning, saw Frank talking to 2 men near the old logging road. One of them was that lawyer fellow, Caldwell. The other was someone I didn't recognize, a big man with a scar on his face. They were arguing about something, getting louder and angrier as they talked." Jacob felt a chill run down his spine as he listened to Mrs. Stone's account. From his elevated position on Eagle Peak, he had an excellent view of the old logging road that wound through the forest north of town. If Mrs. Stone had seen Frank arguing with Caldwell and another man, it suggested that Frank's death might have been connected to the same forces that were now threatening Claire's property. "Did you hear what they were arguing about?" Claire asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. She had always suspected that there was something wrong with the official story of Frank's death, some detail that didn't fit with the careful, cautious man she had married. Frank was an experienced hunter who knew the woods better than most, and the idea of him accidentally shooting himself had never made sense to her. Mrs. Stone closed her eyes, concentrating on the memory with the fierce attention of someone determined to get every detail right. "I couldn't hear all of it from where I was sitting on my porch, but I caught some words. Frank was saying something about not signing anything, about his wife not knowing about some business deal. The lawyer was talking about deadlines and consequences, using that smooth voice of his. The big man didn't say much, but when he did speak, it sounded like threats." Dr. Carter had been listening to the conversation with growing concern, his medical training extending to an understanding of when physical symptoms might be connected to emotional distress. "Mrs. Stone, this is clearly weighing heavily on you. Why didn't you report what you saw to the authorities at the time?" The elderly woman's laugh was bitter and knowing. "Report it to Deputy Tucker? That man wouldn't investigate his own shadow if Blackwood told him not to. I knew that speaking up would just put me in danger without helping anyone. But now they're going after Claire, trying to steal her property with forged papers and fake debts, and I can't stay quiet anymore." Claire felt the world tilt around her as the pieces of a horrible puzzle began falling into place. Frank's Mysterious Parts 3 to 5 continuation. The Truth Unveiled Part 3. The weight of truth Claire felt. The blood drained from her face as Mrs. Stone's words hung in the mountain air like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. Frank's death, which she had mourned as a tragic accident for 3 long years, was beginning to reveal itself as something far more sinister. The careful, methodical man who had taught her to read the weather and plan for every contingency had not died from carelessness with his hunting rifle. He had died because he had refused to sign something that would have endangered their home and their future together. Margaret, Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. Are you certain about what you saw? About the men Frank was talking to that morning? Mrs. Stone nodded with the grim certainty of someone who had been carrying a terrible secret for too long. I've gone over that morning 1,000 times in my mind, dear. I was sitting on my porch shelling peas for Sunday dinner when I heard voices raised in anger. Frank was standing near the tree line where the old logging road curves toward the creek, and those two men had him backed up against a big pine tree. The lawyer fellow was waving papers around, and the big man had his hand resting on something under his coat. When Frank shook his head and turned to walk away, the big man grabbed his arm and spun him around. Jacob found himself listening with the intense focus of a man trained to analyze structural failures and identify the critical points where systems collapsed under pressure. The picture Mrs. Stone was painting suggested that Frank Davidson had been murdered for refusing to cooperate with whatever scheme Blackwood had been developing 3 years ago. The same scheme that was now targeting Claire through forged documents and fraudulent debt claims. Dr. Carter checked Mrs. Stone's pulse again, his face grave with concern for both her physical condition and the implications of what she was revealing. Mrs. Stone, what happened after the big man grabbed Frank's arm? Did you continue to watch? The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears as she relived the memory. I wanted to help him, but I'm an old woman and they were too far away for me to do anything but watch. Frank jerked his arm free and started walking toward his horse, which was tied to a tree about 20 yards away. The lawyer called after him, saying something about final warnings and last chances. Frank never looked back, just mounted his horse and rode off toward the high country where he liked to hunt. Claire felt a crushing weight settle in her chest as she began to understand the magnitude of what had been hidden from her. Frank had been protecting her from something he thought was too dangerous for her to know about, and that protection had cost him his life. The hunting trip that she had assumed was his way of dealing with whatever had been troubling him in those final weeks was actually his attempt to escape from men who were determined to force his cooperation through any means necessary. When did you hear about the accident? Jacob asked quietly, his engineer's mind working to establish a timeline that might reveal the truth of what had happened in the mountains that day. Mrs. Stone wiped her eyes with a handkerchief that had seen better days. 3 days later, when the search party found his body up near Dead Man's Creek. Deputy Tucker said it looked like Frank had been cleaning his rifle and it went off accidentally. But Frank was too careful for that, too experienced. He'd been hunting those mountains since he was a boy, and he knew better than to clean a loaded weapon. The pieces of the puzzle were forming a picture that made Claire feel sick with rage and grief. Frank had been murdered because he wouldn't sign papers that would have given Blackwood access to their property. The same property that Blackwood was now trying to steal through forged documents and fabricated debts. Her husband had died protecting their home, and now she was facing the same threats that had killed him. There's something else, Mrs. Stone continued, her voice growing stronger as the burden of secrecy began to lift from her shoulders. The big man with the scar, I saw him again about a week after Frank's funeral. He was riding through town with Deputy Tucker, and they stopped at the bank to talk with Whitmore. I was at Morrison's store buying flour, and I heard Tucker tell Wright that there might be more accidents if certain people didn't learn to mind their own business. Jacob felt a cold anger building in his chest as he listened to Mrs. Stone's account. The casual way Tucker had threatened the townspeople suggested that Frank's murder was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of intimidation and violence designed to clear obstacles from Blackwood's path. How many other accidents had occurred when honest people refused to cooperate with the developer's schemes? Dr. Carter stood up slowly, his medical bag in hand and his face set in lines of determination that spoke to his professional obligation to protect his patients and his community. Mrs. Stone, I want you to rest for the remainder of the day. This conversation has been very stressful for you, and your heart needs time to recover. But I also want you to know that you've done the right thing by speaking up. The truth has a way of demanding to be heard, regardless of how dangerous it might be. Claire helped Mrs. Stone to her feet, her mind racing with questions about what she should do with the information that had just been placed in her hands. The evidence of Frank's murder was 3 years old and based on the testimony of one elderly woman who had witnessed the events from a distance. Deputy Tucker was clearly involved in the conspiracy, which meant that going to the local authorities would be useless at best and dangerous at worst. But doing nothing meant allowing Frank's killers to succeed in their plans and letting his death go unavenged. Mrs. Stone, Claire said carefully, would you be willing to tell this story to someone in authority? Someone from outside Pine Ridge who might be able to investigate what really happened? The older woman's face set in lines of stubborn courage. That reminded Jacob of Claire's own expression when she had faced down Caldwell and Tucker that morning. If it would help you keep your home and see justice done for Frank, I'd tell it to the territorial governor himself. Those men killed a good man, and they're trying to destroy you. And somebody needs to stop them before they hurt anyone else. Jacob had been silent for several minutes, processing everything he had heard and formulating a plan based on his knowledge of the terrain and his understanding of how men like Blackwood operated. The revelation about Frank's murder changed everything, transforming Claire's fight to save her property from a civil matter into a criminal investigation that would require careful planning and considerable courage to pursue. Mrs. Davidson, Jacob said finally, would you be willing to let me help you gather more evidence about what happened to your husband? I know the mountains where his body was found, and I have some experience with investigating structural failures and determining their causes. Claire looked at Jacob with surprise and gratitude, recognizing the offer for what it was, a commitment to put himself at risk for someone he barely knew. There was something about his quiet strength and obvious competence that made her feel less alone in her fight against forces that had seemed overwhelming just hours before. Mr. Hayes, I appreciate your offer more than I can say, but this isn't your fight. These men have already killed once, and I won't have another death on my conscience because I was too proud to handle this alone. Jacob's expression grew firm, with the kind of determination that had once made him the most trusted engineer on a dangerous railroad line. With respect, Mrs. Davidson, this stopped being just your fight the moment Mrs. Stone told us what she witnessed. Frank Davidson was murdered because he wouldn't let criminals steal his property. If we don't stop them now, how many other good people will die because they refuse to cooperate with Blackwood's schemes? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Claire found herself looking into Jacob's brown eyes and seeing something that had been missing from her life for 3 long years. Purpose, direction, the possibility that she might not have to face her troubles alone. Frank had been gone for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone willing to stand beside her when the world seemed determined to knock her down. What did you have in mind? She asked finally, her voice steady, despite the fear and hope warring in her chest. Jacob glanced around to make sure they couldn't be overheard, then spoke in the low, careful tones of a man discussing matters of life and death. First, we need to examine the place where Frank's body was found. If he was murdered, there might be evidence that the original investigation missed or chose to ignore. Second, we need to find out more about Blackwood's operation and identify the people working with him. Mrs. Stone mentioned a man with a scar who was with Caldwell that morning. If we can identify him, we might be able to connect him to other crimes. Dr. Carter had been listening to their conversation with growing concern and admiration. Mr. Hayes, what you're proposing is dangerous work. If Blackwood's people realize that you're investigating Frank's death, they'll try to silence you the same way they silenced him. Jacob nodded grimly. I understand the risks, Doctor, but I've spent the last 5 years hiding on my mountain while good people suffered because I was too afraid of making mistakes to use the skills I have. Mrs. Davidson deserves to know the truth about her husband's death, and the people of Pine Ridge deserve to be free from the threat of men who murder anyone who stands in their way. Claire felt her heart skip as she heard the conviction in Jacob's voice. This was not the broken hermit of local legend, but a man who had found his purpose again and was prepared to fight for it. The realization that she had somehow been the catalyst for his transformation filled her with a mixture of pride and terror. That took her breath away. There's something else we need to consider, Dr. Carter said thoughtfully. If Frank was murdered because he refused to sign papers giving Blackwood access to your property, then those papers probably still exist somewhere. Caldwell strikes me as the kind of man who keeps careful records of his transactions, legal and otherwise. Jacob's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of an engineer presented with a particularly challenging problem. That's an excellent point. Doctor, if we could get our hands on Caldwell's files, we might find evidence of other fraudulent deals and identify other potential victims. It could be the key to exposing the entire conspiracy. Mrs. Stone had been listening to their planning with the intense focus of someone who understood that the conversation might determine whether justice would finally be served for crimes that had been hidden too long. Caldwell keeps an office above Morrison's store, she offered. I've seen him coming and going at all hours, usually carrying that leather satchel of his. If there are papers to be found, they'd likely be there. Claire felt a chill as she realized what Jacob and the others were suggesting. Breaking into Caldwell's office would be burglary, a serious crime that could result in imprisonment or worse if they were caught. But it might also be the only way to obtain the evidence needed to prove Frank's murder and prevent Blackwood from destroying other families the way he had destroyed hers. I can't ask you to take that kind of risk for me, she said quietly, though her heart was urging her to accept any help that might lead to justice for Frank and protection for her property. Jacob stepped closer to Claire, his presence somehow both comforting and electrifying. You're not asking, Mrs. Davidson. I'm offering. And I'm offering because I believe that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight is dangerous. Your husband died protecting you and your home. The least I can do is help you finish what he started. The words hit Claire like a physical blow, bringing tears to her eyes as she finally understood that Frank's death had not been meaningless, that his refusal to cooperate with Blackwood had been an act of love and courage that deserved to be honored. For 3 years, she had blamed herself for not knowing about the troubles that had led to his death. Now she realized that Frank had chosen to face those troubles alone because he loved her too much to burden her with fears he hoped to resolve. Without her knowledge. All right, she said finally, her voice growing stronger with each word. But we do this together, all of us. If we're going to risk our lives to find the truth, we're going to do it as a team. No one takes unnecessary chances, and no one goes anywhere alone. Dr. Carter nodded approvingly. That's wise thinking, Mrs. Davidson. Safety in numbers and multiple witnesses to anything we might discover. But we'll need to be very careful about timing and planning. Caldwell and Tucker are both dangerous men, and they won't hesitate to use violence if they feel threatened. Jacob was already thinking ahead to the logistics of their investigation, his engineer's mind breaking down the complex problem into manageable components. We'll start with the site where Frank's body was found. I can guide us there without using the main trails, and we can examine the area for evidence that might have been overlooked. Then we'll plan our approach to Caldwell's office based on what we learn from the physical evidence. Mrs. Stone struggled to her feet with the help of Dr. Carter's steady arm, her face showing the exhaustion of her ordeal, but also the satisfaction of someone who had finally shared a burden that had been crushing her for too long. You be careful, all of you. These men have already proven they'll kill to protect their secrets. Don't give them any excuse to add your names to their list of victims. As the small group prepared to separate, each member lost in thoughts of the dangerous path they were about to walk together, Claire found herself looking at Jacob with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. This man, this stranger who had emerged from the mountains like an answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying, was willing to risk everything to help her find justice for Frank and save her home from the men who had murdered her husband. Mr. Hayes, she said quietly, reaching out to touch his arm with fingers that trembled slightly. Thank you for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you're willing to do. Jacob looked down at her hand on his arm, feeling the warmth of her touch through the fabric of his sleeve like a brand that marked him as hers whether she knew it or not. Mrs. Davidson, there's no debt between us. Sometimes people come into our lives at exactly the moment when we need them most. I have a feeling that's what's happening here. The words carried more meaning than either of them was prepared to acknowledge, but both felt the truth of them settling around their hearts like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever challenges they would face, in their quest for justice and truth, they would face them together. And in that togetherness, something new was beginning to grow, something that might survive even the storms that were surely coming. Part 4. Into the high country, the morning mist clung to the valleys like secrets unwilling to be revealed as Jacob led Claire up the narrow trail that wound toward Dead Man's Creek. They had set out before dawn, taking a circuitous route that avoided the main roads and the possibility of being observed by any of Blackwood's people who might be watching for unusual activity. Dr. Carter had remained in town to keep an eye on Mrs. Stone and to serve as their contact point if anything went wrong during their investigation. Claire had never ventured this far into the high country, and she found herself both awed by the rugged beauty of the landscape and impressed by Jacob's intimate knowledge of every rock and tree along their path. He moved through the wilderness with the fluid grace of someone who belonged there, reading signs in the forest that were invisible to her untrained eyes. A broken branch here, a disturbed patch of earth there, the direction of the wind and the behavior of the wildlife all seemed to provide him with information that guided their steps. How much farther? Claire asked as they paused to rest beside a small stream that tumbled down from the peaks above them. Her teacher's constitution was strong, but the steep terrain and thin mountain air were beginning to take their toll on her endurance. Jacob consulted the compass he carried in his pocket, then pointed toward a ridge that rose before them like a green wall studded with granite outcroppings. About another mile, maybe a little more. The creek where Frank's body was found runs through a meadow just beyond that ridge. We should reach it within the hour if we maintain our current pace. Claire nodded and took a long drink from the water bottle Jacob had insisted she carry, grateful for the brief respite but eager to continue their mission. Every step that brought them closer to the truth about Frank's death felt like a step toward justice, and she was determined not to let fatigue or fear slow their progress. As they resumed their climb, Jacob found himself stealing glances at the woman walking beside him with such determination and courage. Claire had proven herself to be far stronger than her delicate appearance suggested, both physically and emotionally. She had accepted the revelation about Frank's murder with a composure that spoke to inner steel, and she had committed herself to the dangerous course of seeking justice with a resolve that reminded Jacob of the best officers he had served under. During his railroad days, Mrs. Davidson, Jacob said as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail, "May I ask you something personal?" Claire looked at him with curiosity, noting the careful formality he maintained even as they shared the intimacy of a dangerous journey together. "Of course, Mr. Hayes. After everything you're doing to help me, I think we're past the point of standing on ceremony." Jacob helped her over a fallen log that blocked their path, his strong hands steadying her with a gentleness that made her heart skip despite her focus on their mission. "I've been wondering about your marriage to Frank. From everything I've observed and everything Mrs. Stone said, you two seem to have been very happy together. That's not as common as it should be, especially out here where life can be so hard." The question surprised Claire with its thoughtfulness and its gentle probing into territory that was still tender despite the passage of time. She found herself wanting to share with Jacob the truth about her relationship with Frank, to help him understand the man whose death they were trying to investigate and perhaps to understand herself better in the process. "We were happy," she said finally, her voice soft with memory. "Frank was a good man, kind and patient and determined to build something lasting in this valley. He taught me to see the beauty in simple things, to find joy in hard work and quiet evenings and the changing of the seasons. But we weren't perfect, Mr. Hayes. We had our struggles like any couple." Jacob waited for her to continue, sensing that there was more she wanted to say but wasn't sure how to express. His own inexperience with intimate relationships made him uncertain about how to encourage her confidence without seeming intrusive or inappropriate. "Frank wanted children very much," Claire continued, her voice growing smaller. "We tried for years, but it never happened. The doctor in Riverdale said there might be something wrong with me, something that prevented conception. Frank never blamed me for it, never made me feel like I was failing him as a wife. But I could see the sadness in his eyes sometimes when he watched other families, and I knew he was disappointed even if he was too kind to say so." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Jacob felt his heart constrict with sympathy for the pain Claire had carried, the sense of inadequacy that had haunted her marriage despite Frank's obvious love and devotion. It explained something about the fierce way she was fighting to preserve their home, as if keeping their property intact could somehow compensate for her inability to give Frank the children he had wanted. "I'm sorry," Jacob said quietly. "That must have been very difficult for both of you." Claire nodded, surprised by how much relief she felt at sharing this long-held burden with someone who listened without judgment. "It was one of the reasons I became so devoted to teaching. The children in my classroom became the family I couldn't give Frank, and he understood that. He used to joke that I was raising half the county's children, and maybe that was enough. The conversation was interrupted by their arrival at the ridge Jacob had pointed out earlier. Before them spread a hidden valley that took Claire's breath away with its pristine beauty. Dead Man's Creek wound through the center of the meadow like a silver ribbon, bordered by willows and wild roses that were just beginning to show their autumn colors. It was the kind of place that might have been created specifically for peaceful contemplation, which made the knowledge of what had happened there all the more disturbing. Jacob studied the landscape with the analytical eye of someone trained to read the stories written in stone and soil and vegetation. The official report said Frank's body was found near the creek, about 200 yards downstream from where we're standing. According to the deputy's account, he was sitting against a large boulder, apparently cleaning his rifle when it discharged accidentally. They made their way down into the meadow, moving carefully to avoid disturbing any evidence that might still remain after 3 years. Jacob had brought a small notebook to record their observations, and he documented everything he saw with the thoroughness that had once made him invaluable to railroad survey crews. The boulder in question was exactly where the report had described it, a massive granite formation that provided a natural shelter from the wind and a comfortable backrest for someone taking a break from hunting. But as Jacob examined the area around it, several details caught his attention that didn't fit with the official story of Frank's death. "Mrs. Davidson, look at this." Jacob called Claire over to examine scratches in the soft earth near the base of the boulder. These look like scuff marks from someone's boots, but they're too deep and too scattered to have been made by a man sitting peacefully and cleaning his weapon. It looks more like signs of a struggle. Claire knelt beside Jacob to examine the marks he had indicated, her heart pounding as she realized what they might represent. If Frank had been forced to fight for his life in this beautiful, peaceful place, then his murder was even more brutal and calculated than she had imagined. Jacob continued his examination of the site, moving in expanding circles around the boulder as he searched for additional evidence. About 30 yards upstream, he found something that made him call Claire over with urgency in his voice. "Look at this tree," he said, pointing to an ancient pine that stood sentinel beside the creek. "See those gouges in the bark, about shoulder height? Those are bullet holes, Mrs. Davidson. At least 3 of them, and they're not old enough to have been made by hunters years ago." Claire stared at the damaged tree with growing horror as the implications became clear. Frank hadn't died from an accidental discharge while cleaning his rifle. He had been shot multiple times by someone who had followed him to this remote location and executed him in cold blood. The peaceful meadow had been the site of a murder, and the truth had been buried under Deputy Tucker's cursory investigation and false report. "There's more," Jacob said grimly, pointing to additional evidence that painted a picture of Frank's final moments. "Look at the pattern of the bullet holes. They're spread out in a way that suggests the shooter was moving, probably chasing Frank as he tried to escape. And see how some of the shots are high and others are low? That indicates panic or excitement on the shooter's part, not the careful aim of someone committing a planned execution." Claire sank down onto a fallen log, overwhelmed by the violence of what they had discovered and the courage Frank must have shown in his final moments. He had fought for his life, had tried to escape from his attackers, had died alone in this beautiful place while she was at home preparing dinner and wondering why he was late returning from his hunting trip. Jacob sat down beside her, his presence solid and comforting in the face of such terrible revelations. "Mrs. Davidson, I know this is difficult to hear, but the evidence suggests that Frank was a very brave man who refused to give up even when facing impossible odds. The scattered nature of the bullet holes indicates that he kept moving, kept fighting, right up until the end." "But why here?" Claire asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "Why follow him all the way up into the mountains to kill him? Why not just shoot him on the road where Mrs. Stone saw them arguing?" Jacob considered the question with the systematic approach he brought to all problems requiring analysis and solution. "I think they were trying to make it look like a hunting accident from the beginning. If Frank had been shot on the road, there would have been too many questions, too much chance that someone would investigate properly. But a hunting accident in a remote location, especially one investigated by a corrupt deputy, could be explained away without much difficulty." The coldness of the calculation behind Frank's murder filled Claire with a rage that burned away. her grief, and left only a determination to see justice done. These men had not only killed her husband, they had planned his death with such care and forethought that they believed they could literally get away with murder. The arrogance of it, the casual cruelty of treating a human life as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed, crystallized her resolve in a way that all her previous anger had not. "We need more evidence," she said firmly, rising from the log with new purpose. "What we've found here proves that Frank was murdered, but it doesn't identify his killers or connect them to Blackwood's operation. We need to search Caldwell's office and find those papers Mrs. Stone mentioned." Jacob nodded approvingly, impressed by Claire's ability to channel her grief into practical action. "You're right, but we need to be very careful about how we approach that search. Caldwell and Tucker are both dangerous men, and they won't hesitate to use violence if they discover what we're doing." As they prepared to leave the meadow and return to town, Jacob took one last look around the site where Frank Davidson had made his final stand against the forces of corruption and greed. The beauty of the place seemed somehow sanctified by the courage that had been displayed there, and Jacob found himself making a silent promise to the dead man that his sacrifice would not be forgotten or unavenged. "Frank," Claire whispered to the mountain air, "I promise you that the men who did this will pay for what they've done. And I promise that our home will remain safe, no matter what it costs me." The words carried across the meadow like a vow, and Jacob felt his own determination strengthen as he heard the steel in Claire's voice. Whatever it took, whatever risks they had to face, they would see justice done for Frank Davidson and protection secured for the woman he had died trying to save. As they began their journey back to Pine Ridge, both Jacob and Claire knew that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. They were no longer simply investigating a suspicious death or trying to save a piece of property. They were declaring war against men who believed themselves above the law, and that war would be fought with whatever weapons they could find and whatever courage they could muster. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks as they made their way down from the high country, and the lengthening shadows seemed to whisper of dangers yet to come. But for the first time since Frank's death, Claire felt that she was not facing those dangers alone. Beside her walked a man whose strength and determination matched her own, and in that partnership lay the hope that justice might finally be served and peace might finally be found. Part 5. Shadows and Revelations. The evening bells of Pine Ridge were tolling 6 o'clock as Jacob and Claire made their way through the gathering dusk toward the center of town. Their investigation at Dead Man's Creek had taken longer than anticipated, but the evidence they had gathered was worth the extended absence. Jacob carried sketches and measurements of the bullet patterns they had found, while Claire held carefully collected samples of soil and bark that might prove useful if they ever got the opportunity to present their case to honest authorities. Morrison's General Store occupied a prime location on Main Street, its two-story structure serving both commercial and residential purposes in the efficient manner of frontier architecture. Samuel Wright lived with his family in the apartment behind the store, while the upstairs rooms were rented to various tenants including, as Mrs. Stone had mentioned, the lawyer Caldwell who represented Blackwood's interests in Pine Ridge. Jacob studied the building from across the street, noting the external staircase that provided access to the second floor and the placement of windows that would allow observation of anyone approaching the premises. The lawyer's office was clearly visible from the street, its windows glowing with lamplight that suggested Caldwell was working late on whatever schemes occupied his attention during normal business hours. "He's still there," Claire observed, following Jacob's gaze to the illuminated windows above the store. "We'll have to wait until he leaves before we can search his office." Jacob nodded, already formulating plans based on his knowledge of the building's layout and the habits of its occupants. Morrison usually closes the store at 7 and retires to his family quarters shortly afterward. If Caldwell follows his usual pattern, he'll work until about 8:30 and then head to the saloon for his evening drink. That should give us a window of opportunity between 9 and midnight to conduct our search. They found a position in the shadows beside the barber shop where they could observe both the front of Morrison's store and the external staircase without being seen by casual passersby. The wait gave them time to discuss their strategy and prepare for the risks they would be taking once they entered Caldwell's office. "Mrs. Davidson," Jacob said quietly, I want you to understand that what we're planning is burglary, regardless of our noble motives. If we're caught, we could face serious criminal charges, and Blackwood's influence with the local authorities would ensure that we received no mercy from the courts. Claire had been considering the same sobering reality during their surveillance of the building. I understand the risks, Mr. Hayes, but I also understand that Frank died because he refused to cooperate with these criminals. If we don't take action to expose their crimes, more innocent people will suffer the same fate he did. Jacob admired her courage even as he worried about her safety. Claire Davidson had shown herself to be stronger and more determined than anyone might have expected from a schoolteacher widow, but she was also walking into a situation that could destroy her life even if they succeeded in their mission. The thought of her facing imprisonment or worse because of his involvement in her troubles filled him with a protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. As they waited for Caldwell to conclude his work for the evening, Jacob found himself thinking about the strange turns of fate that had brought him down from his mountain sanctuary and into partnership with this remarkable woman. 3 days ago, he had been a hermit consumed by guilt and self-recrimination, convinced that his failures made him unfit for human society. Now he was preparing to risk his freedom and possibly his life to help Claire find justice for her murdered husband and save her home from the men who had killed him. The transformation felt both sudden and inevitable, as if everything in his life had been leading toward this moment when he would finally have the chance to use his skills and knowledge for something that mattered more than his own comfort or safety. Claire had awakened something in him that he had thought permanently buried under the weight of his guilt about the mine disaster. Purpose, hope, the possibility that redemption might be earned through action rather than suffered through isolation. At 8:45, Caldwell's office windows went dark and the lawyer emerged from the external staircase carrying his leather satchel and checking his pocket watch with the precise movements of a man accustomed to maintaining strict schedules. He walked purposefully toward the Copper Mountain Saloon, his footsteps echoing in the quiet evening air as he disappeared into the warm glow of the establishment's entrance. Jacob waited another 15 minutes to ensure that Caldwell had settled in for his evening routine before signaling Claire that it was time to move. They crossed the street with the casual gait of people taking an evening stroll, then slipped into the alley beside Morrison's store where the external staircase provided access to the second floor. The lock on Caldwell's office door was more sophisticated than Jacob had expected, requiring several minutes of careful work with the small tools he carried for emergency repairs on his mountain equipment. But his experience with mechanical systems served him well, and he managed to open the door without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. Caldwell's office was a monument to organized efficiency, with filing cabinets arranged along one wall and a massive desk positioned to provide commanding views of both the street below and the appointment area where clients would sit during consultations. Gas lamps provided adequate illumination once Jacob managed to light them, and the room's contents became visible in all their meticulous detail. Claire moved immediately toward the filing cabinets while Jacob examined the papers spread across Caldwell's desk. The lawyer was clearly working on multiple projects simultaneously, with contracts and correspondence sorted into neat stacks that spoke to his methodical approach to the practice of law. But it was the quality of his clients rather than the organization of his work that caught Jacob's attention as he scanned the visible documents. "Mrs. Davidson," Jacob called quietly, "look at these contracts." Caldwell is representing property buyers from Denver, Colorado Springs, even as far away as Chicago. These aren't local real estate transactions. This is a coordinated effort to acquire large blocks of land throughout the valley. Claire abandoned her search of the filing cabinets and joined Jacob at the desk, her eyes widening as she read over his shoulder and began to understand the scope of Blackwood's operation. The contracts represented millions of dollars in potential real estate deals, all contingent on the successful acquisition of key properties that would provide access to transportation routes and water rights. "Look at this map," Claire said, pointing to a large document that showed the entire Pine Ridge Valley with various properties marked in different colors. The red marks indicate properties already acquired, yellow shows properties under negotiation, and green represents target acquisitions. "My property is marked in green, along with the Patterson Farm and the old Kowalski Place." Jacob studied the map with growing understanding of why Blackwood was so determined to acquire Claire's homestead. Her property controlled access to Silver Creek, which provided water rights that would be essential for any large-scale development project. Without control of the creek, Blackwood's plans for a luxury resort would be impossible to implement, regardless of how much other land he managed to acquire. "No wonder they killed Frank," Claire said quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of grief and anger. "My property isn't just valuable, it's absolutely essential to their entire scheme. Without access to the creek, all their other acquisitions become worthless." Jacob was examining other documents when he found something that made his blood run cold. A letter dated just 2 days earlier, addressed to Caldwell from someone identified only as R.B., which Jacob assumed stood for Richard Blackwood. The letter was written in the coded language that criminals often use to discuss illegal activities, but its meaning was clear enough to anyone familiar with the patterns of organized intimidation. "Mrs. Davidson, you need to see this," Jacob said urgently, handing her the letter. "Blackwood is planning to escalate his pressure on you. According to this, if you don't cooperate voluntarily within the next week, they're going to arrange another hunting accident to remove the obstacle to their plans." Claire read the letter with growing horror, realizing that she was facing the same fate that had claimed Frank unless she could find a way to expose Blackwood's crimes and protect herself from his threats. The casual way the letter discussed her potential murder, as if she were nothing more than a business problem to be solved, filled her with a rage that burned away her fear and left only determination to fight back. "There has to be more evidence here," she said firmly, returning to her search of the filing cabinets with renewed urgency. "If Caldwell is documenting his correspondence with Blackwood, he must have records of other illegal activities as well." Jacob's hands trembled slightly as he opened the bottom drawer of Caldwell's desk, finding there a collection of documents that would change everything they thought they knew about Blackwood's operation. Inside a locked metal box that yielded to his careful manipulation was a correspondence file that detailed not just the fraudulent schemes targeting Claire's property, but a network of corruption that extended far beyond Pine Ridge into the territorial government itself. The letters revealed that Blackwood had been systematically acquiring properties throughout Colorado by using a combination of legal manipulation, financial pressure, and, when necessary, violence. Frank Davidson was not his first victim, nor was Claire his first target. Over the past 5 years, at least 7 property owners had died in suspicious circumstances after refusing to sell their land to Blackwood's agents. Each death had been ruled accidental by local authorities who were either incompetent or complicit in the cover-up. Claire found her own file in the cabinet marked Active Acquisitions, and reading through Caldwell's notes about her situation made her feel sick with rage and violation. The lawyer had documented her daily routines, her financial struggles, even her grief over her childless marriage. Every aspect of her private life had been studied and cataloged for potential use as leverage against her resistance to their demands. But it was the final document in her file that nearly brought Claire to her knees with shock and betrayal. A copy of Frank's real will, dated just 3 weeks before his death, which left everything to her along with a letter explaining his growing suspicions about Blackwood's activities and his determination to protect their property from what he called forces of greed and corruption that would destroy our valley. The will had been replaced with a forgery that included debts and obligations that had never existed, providing the legal justification for the foreclosure proceedings that were threatening her home. "Jacob," Claire whispered, her voice breaking, as she held up the authentic will. "Frank knew. He knew they were coming for us, and he tried to protect me. But they killed him before he could warn me about what was happening." Jacob moved to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Frank Davidson had not been a random victim of Blackwood's greed, but a man who had discovered the truth about the land acquisition scheme and had been murdered to prevent him from exposing it. His death had been both an act of silencing a potential whistleblower and a strategic move to gain control of the property that was essential to Blackwood's plans. The sound of footsteps on the external staircase froze both of them in place, their hearts racing as they realized that someone was approaching Caldwell's office. Jacob quickly extinguished the gas lamps while Claire gathered the most incriminating documents into her shawl. both of them moving with the desperate silence of people whose lives depended on remaining undetected. The footsteps paused outside the office door, and they could hear the rattle of keys as someone prepared to enter. Jacob grabbed Claire's hand and led her toward the window that faced the alley behind the building, hoping they could escape before whoever was coming had a chance to discover their presence. But as he began to open the window, the office door swung open and lamplight flooded the room. Well, came Caldwell's smooth voice from the doorway. It seems we have visitors who don't understand the concept of private property. How deliciously ironic, considering the current legal disputes surrounding Mrs. Davidson's own property claims. Behind Caldwell stood Deputy Tucker and two other men that Jacob didn't recognize, all of them armed and clearly prepared for violence. The trap had been perfectly laid, suggesting that their surveillance of the building had been observed and reported to Blackwood's people. They had walked directly into the hands of the men they were trying to expose, and escape now seemed impossible. Mrs. Davidson, Caldwell continued with mock politeness. I must say I'm disappointed in your choice of criminal associates. Breaking and entering is such an unseemly activity for a respectable widow and schoolteacher. What would your students think if they knew their teacher was a common burglar? Claire stepped forward with her chin raised in defiance, the stolen documents still clutched against her chest like armor against their threats. They would think I was fighting to protect my home from murderers and thieves. We found your correspondence with Blackwood, Mr. Caldwell. We know what you did to Frank, and we know what you're planning to do to me. Deputy Tucker moved deeper into the room, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol as he positioned himself to prevent any attempt at escape through the window. Now that's a serious accusation, Mrs. Davidson. Of course, dead folks can't repeat accusations, especially when they die in unfortunate accidents like your husband did. Jacob felt the familiar surge of protective anger that had driven him down from his mountain sanctuary, but this time it was tempered by the strategic thinking that had once made him a successful engineer. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were not helpless. The evidence they had discovered gave them leverage if they could find a way to use it, and the confined space of the office limited their captor's ability to maneuver freely. Mr. Caldwell, Jacob said with the calm authority of a man accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations, before you do something that can't be undone, you should know that we're not the only ones who know about your activities. Dr. Carter and Mrs. Stone are both aware of our investigation, and they have instructions to contact the territorial authorities if we don't return safely to town. Caldwell's confident expression faltered slightly as he considered the implications of Jacob's claim. If word of their investigation had already spread beyond the two people standing in his office, then silencing them might not be enough to protect Blackwood's operation from exposure. The careful web of secrecy and intimidation that had protected them for so long could unravel quickly if the right people began asking the right questions. You're bluffing, Tucker said with less certainty than his words suggested. Nobody's going to believe wild stories from a crazy hermit and a desperate widow, especially not when they're both dead from another tragic accident. Claire saw her opportunity in Tucker's obvious nervousness and pressed their advantage with the courage of a woman who had nothing left to lose. We copied the documents before you arrived, Deputy. Copies that are already in the hands of people who will ensure they reach honest authorities if anything happens to us. Your conspiracy is finished, Mr. Caldwell. The only question now is whether you'll face trial for fraud and murder, or whether you'll try to add more bodies to your list of victims. The silence that followed Claire's declaration stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the distant sounds of the saloon crowd and the ticking of the clock on Caldwell's desk. The four men who had seemed so confident just moments before were now exchanging uncertain glances, their carefully laid plans suddenly complicated by the possibility that their crimes might already be beyond concealment. Jacob used the moment of uncertainty to position himself between Claire and their captors, his body coiled with the tension of a man prepared to fight for the life of someone he had come to care about more than his own safety. The realization that he would willingly die to protect Claire hit him with stunning clarity, along with the understanding that his feelings for her had grown far beyond simple admiration or protective instinct. There's another option, Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man making a final offer before violence became inevitable. You could let us walk out of here and disappear into the mountains. Mrs. Davidson and I will take our evidence and leave Colorado permanently. You'll never see us again, and your secrets will be safe." Caldwell laughed with genuine amusement, the sound cold and reptilian in the confines of the small office. "Mr. Hayes, you disappoint me with such a naive proposal. Do you really think we would trust our freedom and our fortunes to the word of two people who have already proven their willingness to steal and deceive? No. I'm afraid the only permanent solution to our problem involves ensuring that neither of you will ever have the opportunity to repeat your accusations." The lawyer nodded to Tucker, who drew his pistol with the practiced motion of a man accustomed to using violence as a tool of intimidation. But as the deputy raised his weapon, Claire suddenly threw herself forward, not away from the gun but toward it, her desperate gamble catching Tucker off guard and causing him to stumble backward toward the window. Jacob reacted instantly, launching himself at the nearest of Caldwell's associates while the man was distracted by Claire's unexpected attack. Years of physical labor on the mountain had given Jacob strength and speed that his opponents had not anticipated, and he managed to wrestle the man's weapon away before he could bring it to bear. The office erupted into chaos as four people fought in a space barely large enough for two, furniture crashing and papers scattering as the struggle spilled across every corner of the room. Claire managed to break free from Tucker's grasp and scramble toward the door, but Caldwell blocked her path with a small pistol that had appeared in his hand like a magician's trick. "Enough!" the lawyer shouted over the sounds of combat. "Everyone stop, or I'll put a bullet in Mrs. Davidson's heart right now." The threat froze everyone in place. Jacob's hands still wrapped around his opponent's throat, and Tucker's gun pointed at the ceiling where it had been forced during their struggle. Claire stood perfectly still near the doorway, her eyes fixed on Caldwell's weapon with the hypnotic fascination of someone staring at their own death. "That's better," Caldwell said with satisfaction. "Now we can discuss this situation like civilized people. Mr. Hayes, please release my associate and step away from him. Deputy Tucker, kindly point your weapon at our mountain man friend while I decide how to resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding." Jacob slowly released his grip on the man he had been choking, his mind racing as he tried to find some way to turn their desperate situation to their advantage. The stolen documents were scattered across the floor, their evidence of Blackwood's crimes now mixed with the ordinary papers from Caldwell's desk in a confusion that would take hours to sort through. But as Jacob's eyes swept across the scattered papers, he noticed something that made his heart leap with sudden hope. One of the documents that had fallen near his feet was not from Caldwell's files, but a telegram that had apparently been delivered earlier that evening. The message was brief and to the point. "Federal marshals investigating territorial land fraud arriving Pine Ridge. Tomorrow stop Blackwood operation. Compromise stop. Suggest immediate withdrawal stop." The telegram was signed with initials that Jacob didn't recognize, but its meaning was clear enough. Blackwood's conspiracy had been discovered by federal authorities, and law enforcement was already on its way to Pine Ridge to make arrests. Caldwell and his associates were not holding prisoners who threatened their carefully planned operation. They were trapped criminals whose time had run out. "Mr. Caldwell," Jacob said with newfound confidence, "I think you should read the telegram near my left foot before you make any final decisions about our fate." The lawyer frowned and glanced down at the document Jacob had indicated, his face going pale as he read the brief message that spelled the end of everything he had worked to build. The careful conspiracy that had seemed so secure just minutes before was crumbling around him, and the people he had planned to murder might now be his only hope of negotiating some kind of deal with the federal authorities. "This changes nothing," Caldwell said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "If federal marshals are coming, then we simply need to conclude our business here more quickly than originally planned." Tucker had been reading over Caldwell's shoulder, and his face showed the naked fear of a man who understood that their situation had become desperate beyond repair. "Caldwell, if the feds are involved, we need to get out of here now. Killing these two won't solve anything. If Blackwood's whole operation has been compromised." The deputy's panic was contagious, and Jacob could see the other men beginning to lose their nerve as the full implications of the telegram sank in. Criminals who had felt invulnerable behind their wall of local corruption were suddenly facing the prospect of federal prosecution and long prison sentences, or worse. Claire sensed the shift in momentum and pressed their advantage with the instincts of a teacher who understood how to seize control of a situation when authority figures showed weakness. Gentlemen, you have a choice to make. You can add murder to your list of federal crimes, or you can release us and try to disappear before the marshals arrive. Either way, your conspiracy is finished. The only question is whether you'll face trial for fraud or for murder as well. Caldwell's hand trembled slightly as he kept his pistol trained on Claire, his legal mind working through options that all seemed to lead to disaster. If he killed them now, he would have 2 more murders to explain to federal investigators who were already suspicious of his activities. But if he let them go, they would immediately report his crimes to the approaching marshals and ensure that he faced the full weight of federal justice. There's a third option, Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had once managed teams of workers in life-and-death situations. You could cooperate with the federal investigation, testify against Blackwood and his associates in exchange for leniency. Mrs. Davidson and I would be willing to support a plea arrangement if it meant seeing justice done for Frank's murder. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to drowning men, and Jacob could see Caldwell's desperate mind seizing on it as a potential path to survival. The lawyer was intelligent enough to understand that his position was hopeless, but perhaps not hopeless enough to justify throwing away any chance of redemption. How do I know you won't simply turn me over to the marshals regardless of any agreement we might reach? Caldwell asked, his weapon still pointed at Claire, but his finger no longer quite so tight on the trigger. Claire stepped forward slightly, her voice steady despite the fear she felt at having a gun pointed at her heart. Because unlike you, Mr. Caldwell, we believe in justice rather than revenge. If you're willing to help us ensure that Frank's killers face trial and that other families are protected from Blackwood's schemes, then we're willing to help you find a path toward redemption. The word redemption seemed to hit Caldwell like a physical blow, and for the first time since they had met him, Jacob saw something human flicker in the lawyer's cold eyes. Perhaps there was still enough conscience left in the man to recognize the possibility of choosing something other than violence and corruption. Tucker had been listening to the negotiation with growing agitation, his own desperation making him less willing to consider options that didn't involve immediate escape. Caldwell, this is crazy talk. We kill them both, burn the office to destroy the evidence, and get out of town before sunrise. Once we're clear of Colorado, the feds will never find us. The deputy's crude plan crystallized everyone's understanding of the choice that lay before them. They could choose violence and flight, accepting the life of fugitives, always looking over their shoulders for pursuing justice. Or they could choose to face the consequences of their actions and try to salvage something decent from the wreckage of their conspiracy. Caldwell looked around the room at the scattered papers that represented years of carefully planned crimes, at the faces of his associates who were waiting for his decision, at Claire and Jacob who stood ready to offer him a chance at redemption he had never expected to receive. The weight of all his choices seemed to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had been running from his conscience for too long. Deputy Tucker, he said quietly, put your weapon away. We're going to accept Mr. Hayes's proposal. Tucker stared at him in disbelief. Have you lost your mind? These people will see us all hanged. No, Caldwell said with growing conviction. They'll see us tried in a court of law with the possibility of mercy if we cooperate fully with the federal investigation. That's more justice than we deserve, and more hope than we had 5 minutes ago. Jacob felt a surge of relief, so intense it nearly made him dizzy as he watched the immediate threat to their lives dissolve into the possibility of peaceful resolution. But even as he celebrated their survival, his mind was already working ahead to the challenges that would come with tomorrow's arrival of federal marshals and the beginning of formal proceedings against Blackwood's conspiracy. Claire moved to Jacob's side, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that spoke to the bond that had formed between them during their shared danger. Looking up into his eyes, she saw reflected there the same mixture of relief and affection that was flooding through her own heart. Mr. Hayes, she said softly, I believe you saved my life tonight. Jacob looked down at her upturned face, seeing in her expression not just gratitude, but something deeper, that made his heart race with possibilities he had never dared to imagine. "Mrs. Davidson," he replied with a smile that transformed his weathered features. "I believe we saved each other." The words hung between them like a promise, and even surrounded by the chaos of the disrupted office and the presence of the men who had tried to kill them, they felt the beginning of something that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows of Caldwell's office, federal marshals could be seen approaching the building with the purposeful stride of law enforcement officers prepared to make arrests. The conspiracy that had terrorized Pine Ridge for so long was finally coming to an end, but for Jacob and Claire, it felt more like a beginning. Standing together in the growing light, they both understood that they had found something worth fighting for that went beyond justice for Frank's murder or protection for Claire's property. They had found each other, and in that finding, they had discovered that love could grow even in the darkest soil of tragedy and loss. "I've been waiting for you all my life," Jacob whispered to Claire as the marshals began climbing the stairs to take custody of Caldwell and his associates. "I just didn't know it until now." Claire's answer was lost in the commotion of the arrests, but Jacob saw it in her eyes and felt it in the way her hand tightened on his arm. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they would face as they rebuilt their lives in the aftermath of Blackwood's conspiracy, they would face them together. And in that togetherness, they had found the redemption that had eluded them both during their years of solitary struggle. The mountain man had come down from his peak to find more than justice for a murdered man. He had found a future worth living and a woman worth sharing it with. And the lonely widow had discovered that her heart was not buried with her first husband, but was capable of opening again to embrace a love that was different but no less precious than what she had lost. As the marshals led Caldwell and Tucker away in chains, Jacob and Claire stood together in the ruins of the office where they had nearly died, watching the sun rise over a valley that was finally free from the shadow of corruption and fear. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new possibilities, but today belonged to them and to the love that had been born in the crucible of shared danger and mutual courage. The ghost of Eagle Peak had found his way back to the world of the living, and he had brought with him a woman who understood that some treasures were worth any risk to claim and protect. Together, they would write a new chapter in the story of Pine Ridge, one that spoke of love triumphant over hatred and hope victorious over despair. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.